The wooden door exploded off its hinges with a deafening crack. Clara Dawson stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat as the shadow of Silas Crow filled the doorway, his revolver gleaming under the flicker of lantern light. Every step he took toward her was heavy with menace. Beside her, Elijah Kane tightened his grip on his own gun, his jaw set, eyes locked on the outlaw. He knew one truth. Tonight, a single heartbeat could decide life or death. The room pulsed with silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the whisper of desert wind through shattered wood. No lawmen, no neighbors, just three souls in a standoff where one mistake meant blood on the floor and a destiny neither of them could escape. Clara Dawson's bare feet ached against the splintered planks of the auction stage. The sun blazed mercilessly and sweat slid down her back, but she kept her chin high. Below, familiar faces from town stared at her like livestock, their eyes greedy and cold. Her father's gambling had taken everything. First went the mule, then the land. The small farmhouse where she'd slept under a patched quilt for 23 years now belonged to the men who stood smirking below her. And she, his only daughter, the last thing of value, was the final debt to be collected. The auctioneer, a rail-thin man with a voice like a whip crack, barked the opening bid. $50, a strong young woman, fit for housework, field work, whatever a man requires. A cheer rose from the crowd. 50, came the first shout, from a man whose shirt bore dark tobacco stains and whose jaw worked constantly, chewing and spitting. His lips twisted in something like a smile, though there was nothing kind in it. 75, another called, a grizzled rancher missing half his teeth. He licked his lips, and Clara's stomach lurched. Every bid was a nail driven into her chest. Every dollar was a piece of her freedom slipping further out of reach. She forced herself to keep her back straight, her chin tilted high, as her mother had taught her when she was a girl. But inside, panic clawed at her like a wild animal. Would she be bought by a cruel man? Would she vanish into some distant ranch to work until her body gave out? Would anyone even remember her name? The heat pressed down. Dust clung to her damp skin. The auctioneer's call rang over the square. $75. Do I hear 80? 80 for the girl? And then it happened. A voice, deep and deliberate, cut through the air like a rifle shot. 200. The world seemed to stop. Even the cicadas in the cottonwoods paused. Heads turned toward the edge of the crowd, where a lone man stood in the shade of a leaning post. He wore a dusty hat and weathered boots, the kind every drifter owned, and his leather vest was worn soft with age. But there was something different in the way he held himself. Calm, unshaken, as though he commanded the space without even trying. It was as if the desert wind itself waited for him to move. The crowd murmured, stunned. $200 was 6 months' wages for most men. The stranger stepped forward, the dry earth crunching beneath his boots. His gaze locked on Clara, and for reasons she couldn't explain, her chest tightened. "My name's Elijah," he said simply, his voice steady as stone. In that moment, Clara Dawson felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself in days. Hope, or perhaps fear of a different kind. They left the auction square in heavy silence. Elijah Kane walked ahead, his black stallion snorting softly, the rope biting Clara's wrists. Where are you taking me?" she whispered. He gave no answer. Clara's fear gnawed at her belly, but curiosity began to snake its way through the terror. She noticed things now, things she had been too panicked to see at the auction. The saddle was flawless, the leather so well oiled it glowed in the fading sun. Its silver buckles and hand-tooled details whispered of money, of care, of a life far removed from dust-choked streets and gambling debts. His gun belt was the kind worn by professionals, not farmhands, dark leather molded perfectly to his hip, the revolver gleaming though well-used. And when Elijah shifted his vest, the movement exposed a roll of cash thick enough to buy the whole town twice over. Clara's throat went dry. This wasn't just a cowboy. This was a man with power in his silence and wealth tucked into the shadows of his unassuming disguise. She swallowed hard. Why me?" she whispered almost to herself. Elijah glanced over his shoulder for the first time since they had left the square. His eyes were dark and unreadable, a storm she couldn't see the bottom of. "Because I said 200, he said simply, before turning forward again. It wasn't the answer she wanted. It wasn't the answer that made the cold knot in her chest loosen. The desert stretched endlessly around them, an ocean of ochre and crimson rock. The sun slid toward the horizon, and the sky bled into shades of fire, orange, red, and finally a purple that promised a swift desert night. Far away, a lone coyote called, the sound thin and eerie in the empty space. Clara's mind churned as they walked. Who was this man, really? He didn't talk like the ranchers and drifters she knew. There was a stillness in him that felt practiced, like someone who had lived a life of control, of waiting, of always staying one move ahead. Yet he had spent $200 on her without blinking, more than most men made in half a year. For what? As fear simmered in her chest, shame followed close behind. Part of her was grateful she hadn't been bought by the tobacco-stained man, or the one missing his teeth, or any of the others who had leered at her like wolves. And yet she was still bought, and this stranger's silence left her imagination to twist into darker shapes. Was he a lonely man who wanted a servant? A rancher who needed another pair of hands? Or was there something far worse in his quiet claim over her life? The wind picked up as they left the last signs of town behind. Sagebrush and desert grass swayed in low whispers. Shadows lengthened, stretching toward the horizon like dark fingers. Clara's wrist throbbed against the rope. She finally dared to speak again. "Please," she said softly, I can walk without it. I won't run." Elijah slowed, turning to face her fully for the first time. The last light of the sun caught his face, and for a fleeting second, she saw something vulnerable in his eyes, a depth she didn't expect. He studied her in silence, then untied the rope with one firm tug. The coarse fibers fell away, leaving angry red marks on her skin. "You're not a prisoner," he said, his voice low, like the distant rumble of a coming storm. "But don't mistake your freedom for safety. Not yet." His words sent a chill down her spine, even in the heat of the dying day. And as they resumed their journey, Clara realized something with a cold, creeping certainty. She hadn't escaped danger. She had merely stepped into a different kind of cage, one built not of wood and rope, but of secrets. And Elijah Kane, silent, controlled, and unreadable, was holding the key. The sun had nearly disappeared by the time Clara Dawson realized they were leaving the known world behind. The dirt path twisted through jagged red rocks and dry washes, a labyrinth of desert scrub and whispering wind. No other homes dotted the horizon. No lantern light flickered from distant windows. They were utterly alone, swallowed by the wilderness. Every step the black stallion took sounded like a drum beat in Clara's chest. Her mind kept circling back to the same thought. Where is he taking me? Elijah Kane rode ahead, silent, his silhouette tall and unshaken against the burning horizon. Occasionally he would glance back to check her pace, but he said nothing. That calm, controlled quiet was beginning to frighten her more than shouting ever could. The trail sloped upward, climbing a ridge littered with dry mesquite and rust-colored stone. Clara's skirt snagged on thorns as she struggled to keep up, her boots kicking loose pebbles that tumbled down the slope. Her breathing turned ragged, but she didn't dare ask for a rest. Then as they reached the top of the hill, the world opened up, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. In a hollow of cottonwood trees stood a two-story mansion with a wraparound porch and stained glass windows, a fountain trickling in its garden where only dust should exist. She stopped walking, stunned. This is your place?" she whispered, disbelief threading through every syllable. Elijah hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "It's been in the family," he said. His voice was steady, but to Clara's ears the words sounded brittle, like a lie he'd practiced but didn't believe himself. Her thoughts spun, the polished saddle, the silver buckles, the roll of cash thick enough to buy the town twice over. It all made sense now. The man who had bought her was no wandering cowboy. He was a man of means, and this desert palace was proof. As they descended into the basin, a soft breeze carried the scent of water and flowers. Clara's heart beat faster, not with comfort, but with unease. She had been raised to believe that wealth came with chains of its own. A poor man might break you with his hands. A rich man might break you with the cage he built around you. When they reached the front steps, the door opened before Elijah could knock. A woman stepped out, a figure of poise in a crisp apron and polished shoes, her black hair streaked with silver and tied into a neat bun. She looked nothing like the rough, dust-covered women Clara knew from town. "Senor Kane," she greeted warmly, before her eyes drifted to Clara and froze. "Oh, I didn't know we were expecting a guest." Clara stiffened, the words slamming into her chest. Senor Kane, not Elijah, not a nameless drifter. Kane. The name flickered in her memory like the flash of a lantern in a storm. She'd heard it whispered in Millstone, always with the weight of respect or fear. Railroads, cattle, mining camps. Land that stretched farther than a man could ride in a day. She turned to him slowly, her voice trembling with accusation and awe. You're not just some cowboy, are you?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, Clara saw something crack through the calm, the faintest glimmer of regret. "Inside," he said finally, stepping past her and into the house. Clara hesitated on the porch, her gaze drifting over the immaculate garden and the massive isolated house. There were no other buildings, no ranch hands, no neighbors. Just this oasis in the middle of a desert wasteland. A cold truth slid into her chest like a knife. If she screamed, no one would hear. If she ran, the desert would swallow her before she reached the nearest town. She stepped inside, her shoes clicking on polished hardwood. The interior was as lavish as the exterior. Oil paintings, Persian rugs, the gleam of a chandelier overhead. A hallway stretched into darkness, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and oil lamps. Wealth like this didn't belong to a man who drifted from town to town. Wealth like this belonged to someone who owned pieces of the world. Her pulse thundered as she followed him into the parlor. Elijah finally turned to face her fully. "You're safe here," he said. But the words, soft as they were, sent a chill crawling up her spine. Safe, for now. The last colors of twilight were fading to bruised purple when the first hoofbeats reached the mansion. Clara Dawson froze at the sound, a faint, distant thunder rolling across the desert. It grew louder with each passing second, until it was no longer the whisper of the horizon, but a pounding in her chest, like the earth itself was warning her. Danger is coming. Elijah Kane was already at the window, his body a dark silhouette against the warm glow of the parlor lamps. His jaw tightened as he watched a cloud of dust rise from the canyon road. "They've come for you," he said simply. Clara's stomach twisted. She didn't need to ask who they were. Within minutes, 4 riders emerged from the dusk, their shapes sharp against the fading light. The leader rode a dappled gray horse, his posture easy, predatory. Even at a distance, Clara could feel the weight of his presence, like a shadow falling over her soul. Silas Crow. She had seen him once before, watching from the street as he spat tobacco into the dirt and laughed with men whose pockets jingled with other people's losses. Even from afar, she'd known instinctively. That man is danger wearing a human face. Now he was here, and he wasn't alone. 3 armed riders flanked him, their hats pulled low, their eyes glinting under the first stars of night. The hoofbeats slowed as the gang approached the mansion. The black stallion outside whickered and pawed at the dirt, nervous. No other sounds filled the desert but the soft trickle of the fountain and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Elijah's hand hovered near his revolver. "Stay behind me," he said without looking at Clara. She obeyed, her heart hammering as the riders dismounted with casual precision. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't need to be. Predators rarely rushed when they knew their prey had nowhere to run. A heavy boot slammed against the front door, and it swung inward with a splintering crack. Clara gasped, stumbling backward as Silas Crow stepped into the light. The man was a wall of menace, broad-shouldered, with weathered skin, and a jawline marked by an old scar that caught the lantern glow. His eyes were cold, sharp as cut glass, and when his mouth curled into a smile, it was the kind that made your bones want to hide. "Evening, Kane," he drawled, voice low and oily. "Thought you could steal our property?" His revolver gleamed in his hand, casual yet ready. the way a rattlesnake's coils are casual before the strike. Elijah stood tall in the center of the parlor, the chandelier's light glinting off the barrel of his own gun. "She's not property," he said, his tone a slow coil of steel. Silas chuckled darkly. "Everything's property if the debt says so. Your $200 don't make her yours. She's ours." Behind him, the other outlaws fanned into the doorway, their boots heavy on the polished floor. One of them, a wiry man with a crooked grin, ran a finger along the banister, leaving a streak of dust. "Fancy place for a drifter," he said. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her pulse roaring. She thought of the auction block, of the way the men had looked at her like she wasn't human. She had escaped one nightmare only to walk into another. Then Elijah spoke, and his voice changed. Lower, sharper, like a blade finally leaving its sheath. "Tell me something, Crow. Do you remember Catherine?" The name cut through the room like a gunshot. Silas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Clara to see the truth spark in his eyes. "She was 19, Elijah continued. "Just a girl, my sister, and you sold her to a mining camp up north." Silas shrugged, the faintest twitch of his scarred jaw. "Business is business. She should have minded her family's debt." Clara felt the words like a slap. Even she, bound in fear, flinched at the casual cruelty in his tone. Elijah's face didn't change, but his stillness was more dangerous than rage. "She died there, worked to death in the dark, and I swore the men responsible would face justice." The room hummed with the silence that precedes bloodshed. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Clara realized her own fear was shifting. The helpless girl who had trembled on the auction block was hardening into someone else. Someone who understood that survival might mean doing more than cowering. Her gaze flicked to the revolver resting on the mantel. Her fingers itched, but they trembled too. Silas's men shifted, boots creaking against the polished floor. One leaned against the wall like he owned it. Another tilted his head toward Clara, his grin sharp with implication. "You can't fight all of us, Kane," Silas said finally. "Hand the girl over, and maybe we let you keep breathing." Elijah's eyes narrowed to slits. "You walked into my home," he said. "You threatened what's mine. And you think I'm going to hand her over?" A beat passed. Then he tilted his head toward Clara, never breaking his stare from Silas. "Get the gun." Her breath caught. She hesitated only a moment before grabbing the revolver, its weight alien but solid in her shaking hands. Silas's eyes slid to her, amused. "Little bird's gonna bite, huh?" he taunted. "You ever shot a man before?" Clara's voice wavered but did not break. "No, but I've got good reason to start." A cold smile touched Elijah's lips. In that moment, prey became predator, and Clara Dawson felt a spark of steel ignite in her chest. The room was a powder keg, and every heartbeat was the strike of a match. The desert night pressed against the windows. The fountain outside kept trickling, oblivious to the storm about to break. Then, as the silence stretched thin as glass, the first gunshot split the air like lightning across a black sky. Clara Dawson flinched as the recoil of the revolver shuddered through her arms. The shot struck true enough to make Silas Crow stagger back, his shoulder jerking violently as the bullet tore through flesh. A roar escaped him, half rage, half disbelief. He had underestimated the girl who, just days ago, had stood barefoot on an auction block. Smoke curled from the barrel of Clara's gun as her hands trembled, but her green eyes burned with newfound steel. Across the room, Elijah Kane didn't hesitate. The moment Silas's men twitched toward their holsters, Elijah fired. The parlor erupted into chaos and thunder. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Lantern light flickered as the chandelier swayed under the vibration of gunfire. One of Silas's men dove behind a heavy chair, his own revolver barking in response. Another ducked toward the window, the glass shattering into a rain of jagged shards. Elijah moved with the calm precision of a man who had lived through violence before. He rolled behind the thick oak dining table, firing measured shots that pinned the outlaws back. "Clara!" he barked over the noise. "Stay low!" She ducked behind the sofa, her heart pounding in her ears. The revolver clutched against her chest. Smoke filled the room, carrying the acrid tang of black powder. Outside, the fountain trickled softly, a cruel reminder that somewhere the world was calm and unbroken, while here, life and death were wrestling for dominance. Silas Crow's voice cut through the chaos, raw with fury. "Kill them both!" The outlaw with the crooked grin lunged from cover, his gun aimed squarely at Clara. Time slowed. She could see every detail: the gleam of his teeth, the dirt under his nails, the reflection of lamplight on his barrel. Her breath hitched, but her finger found the trigger. The revolver kicked against her palm, and the man fell, his weapon clattering across the floorboards. Shock and horror warred in Clara's chest, but so did something else, a grim, unyielding resolve. She had not asked for this fight, but she would not die as a victim. Elijah took advantage of the opening. He surged from cover, a blur of dark coat and determination, his revolver barking twice in rapid succession. The second outlaw went down with a cry, his gun skittering across the polished floor. Only Silas remained, leaning against the doorframe, blood soaking his shirt. His revolver wavered, but his hate was steady, burning through the pain. "This ain't over, Cain," he spat. "Even if I fall, others will come. Men like me always do." Elijah's jaw tightened. His voice was low, steady, final. "Then I'll be waiting for them." At that moment, the thunder of hoofbeats erupted outside. Clara's heart leapt to her throat, but Elijah's expression hardened into something like grim satisfaction. The front door burst open again, but this time it wasn't outlaws. It was the Pinkerton agents. 6 men in dark coats and dust-covered hats stormed in with rifles raised, their boots striking the floor in perfect rhythm. "Drop your weapon, Crow," the lead agent commanded. "By order of the federal courts, you're under arrest." Silas's sneer faltered for the first time. He glanced at Clara, at the girl who had defied him, who had fired the shot that ended his grip on her fate, and then at Elijah, standing unshaken amid the smoke and broken glass. Slowly, he let the revolver clatter to the floor. 2 agents grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back. Another began collecting the fallen guns and checking the bodies of the wounded outlaws. The room was a wreck, bullet holes in the walls, shattered windows letting in the cool desert night, and the faint scent of blood mingling with gunpowder. Clara sank to her knees, the revolver slipping from her fingers. Her chest heaved with every breath, the enormity of what had just happened pressing down on her like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. Elijah approached slowly, kneeling beside her. His rough, calloused hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "You did well," he said quietly. "You saved your life, and mine." Her throat tightened. I shot him." The image of the man she'd killed, his surprised eyes, the way he fell, would not leave her. Elijah nodded solemnly. "Sometimes surviving means doing what you never thought you could." The agents dragged Silas Crow and his remaining men outside, shackled and cursing. The sound of their voices faded as the desert swallowed them, replaced by the soft rustle of the night wind. Hours later, after statements were given and evidence collected, the mansion was quiet again. Lanterns flickered against the scarred walls. Bullet holes stood as grim reminders of the night Clara's life had changed forever. She sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars as if they might tell her who she was now. This morning, she had been a farmer's daughter, powerless and forgotten. By nightfall, she was a survivor, marked by fire and lead, holding the memory of her first gunshot deep in her bones. Elijah joined her, his coat draped loosely over his shoulders, the desert wind tugging at the edges. "You have a choice now," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I can give you enough money to start anywhere, another town, another life, or I can stay," she finished quietly, staring out at the horizon. He nodded once. "Not as someone I bought, not as someone in debt, but as a partner, an equal." The words settled over her like the first light of dawn, warm, steady, and full of possibility. Clara Dawson exhaled, letting the desert air fill her lungs. She wasn't the same girl who had stood on that auction block, and for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she never would be again. And so Clara Dawson's life changed forever on that desert night. From a frightened young woman on an auction block To a survivor who faced her fears, she proved something timeless. True courage is often born in the darkest moments. Even though this story takes place in the rugged days of the Wild West, its lessons echo in our modern lives. Today, we may not face outlaws on horseback or be sold for debts, but many people still feel trapped by circumstances, by fear, or by the weight of someone else's choices. Clara's journey reminds us that standing up for yourself, finding your inner strength, and refusing to remain a victim are battles we all fight, no matter the century. It also raises questions we can carry into our own lives. When faced with injustice, do we act or stay silent? Is freedom something given to us or something we claim for ourselves? And what would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes that night? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you see parts of your own life reflected in Clara's story? Have you ever faced a moment where courage meant doing something you never thought you could? Thank you for listening to this tale from the frontier. If it moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Your stories and reflections make this community stronger, and together we keep these powerful lessons alive.